Here we start. What better way to start than with a scream? By the way, interrupt me at any point if you have a question about anything. And when we start with a scream, you can see in your study guide, it says turn of the century. Now, turn of the century is not actually a movement, right? It's a kind of broad time period. And turn of the century does not give me a date. I'd rather you give me some kind of date, but it can be very rounded off. It can be circa, that would be C period, means round about 1890 or 1895, or basically the 1890s. All of that would be good. That locates us in the turn of the century, but it also tells us what century it is. If you just say turn of the century, that just doesn't get pinpointed enough. The movements I would accept for Munch would be symbolism or proto-expressionism. And either one would be all right. You can see that they lead in different ways. If you call him a proto-expressionist, you're already thinking about, and now that you've been through expressionism, what is expressionistic about his work? And our short-term definition for expressionism, from the inside out, right? Or you can be really amazing, and in your blue book, you can quote the artist and say pictures from the reverse side of the eye, which is another way to say from that inside out. Reality filtered through a psyche, through an individual temperament. We're already getting to some of the things that we would identify with expressionism. And when it gets expressed is kind of an intense feeling about it, rather than observed facts. So do you see the emphasis on the subjective psyche instead of just the objective subject matter? Okay, we talked about you want to think about what's important about the subject. Well, in a way, it's a man standing on a bridge. But that is not really its true content, its true subject. So this is probably a picture of angst. Remember, we talked about Munch's body of work as being something that could be looked at as like a play that you might call, and that he called, in fact, when he thought about the body of his work, as motifs from the life of a modern soul. And that's really something there in the 1890s to think about. What is it to make motifs from the life of a modern soul? We said that this play kind of unfolds. It's kind of a cycle of life. And it unfolds into 4 acts of the play, or 4 chapters, we could say. The first one being seeds of love. The second one being love's maturity, its climax, and its passing. Then Act 3, angst. And Act 4, death. Now, this would fall then very much into angst. And I think when we're talking about Munch this way, when we're talking about motifs from the life of modern soul, that it gives us a kind of picture of angst, we're probably talking about him more as a symbolist. Now, you want to think about symbolism means. Symbolism, the movement when words fail. The movement where you ask the big questions of life, these big questions of life cycle, the biggest question often being that of death. Why are we all here if we're all here to die? So asking big questions that no longer have clear-cut answers. When it's for motifs of the modern soul, it's not the old-fashioned tradition of mythology, Christian iconography, or Greek mythology, or the academy. So those big kinds of questions that maybe the only answer is a scream. Now, when the answer is a scream, now we're starting to think context. And context for Munch is this rapidly changing world. Rapidly changing in terms of an industrial revolution, if you want to get more specific. And part of the industrial revolution's progress involves a kind of fallout. You know, that progress has to be kind of put in scare quotes and thought about. Because what goes along with it is the kind of new alienation from nature, with the machines starting to move into play. What also is starting to happen is the sense of a psychological turmoil, psychological sense of upheaval in terms of identity in big cities. That's a different identity than in a small rural town where everybody would know you. Identity in terms of genders. So much is shifting. And remember, anything kind of connected to expressionism it feels such a rapid shift. There are some generations where you feel so much more rapid shift that it does become a kind of sons against the fathers. The world you've inherited It's just not the world your fathers grew up in. While that's always true to an extent, sometimes there's a sharper, abrupt change of events. So the world of the 19th century, the God-given divine world of nature, is rapidly shifting toward a new kind of alienation from nature with industry and a new focus on human nature. So, I mean, this gets big. Remember, 5 minutes have already gone by. You're trying to write all this down. So you have to find out what is sort of key for you to put this into perspective. That play on human nature points to a parallel, not an influence, direct influence, but a parallel with Freud. The sort of discovery of the unconscious, perhaps pictures from the first sight of the eye coming from there. So unconscious anxieties. So what you have is the age of Freud and a kind of psychic vertigo going on in the age of Freud. What happens too is then the firm grounding of where you stood in the 19th century is giving way. This is like a kind of frenzied psychic earthquake, too, in a sense, of where you stand. Remember the picture, how do they play this out? How do you get to the anti-natural quality? Why does he go there? Why does he go towards something against naturalism? Why does he start to abstract? Because it's a reality filtered through the psyche. So then we see, in an anti-naturalistic way, a blood-red sky, his words, a blood-red sky. You see the fact that up becomes down. The bridge that should be overlooking the water is in the picture. The water that's below is up on top, kind of coming over. So you see a kind of tsunami of emotions. You see this kind of stretched, and remember in Expressionism, sharpening of a foreshortening of the space. A space that's kind of measured psychologically in terms of alienation from the other, the separation, primal separation. So there's so many things to work with in this picture where Moon takes a kind of personal episode where he felt the unending scream of nature piercing through all being, where he had this experience on the bridge, but he kind of universalizes it so it's motifs of a modern soul, so that we all can plug into it. And that takes some abstraction to do that. So you figure out how this work becomes our sort of poster child of how to open up the 20th century. We know that he did this work again and again. He did it in woodblock prints as well, working between woodblocks and painting. That's something we'll see the later German Expressionists do a lot. They will revere him. So that is the proto-expressionist side of him. What we also get here is, again, a picture where words sort of fail, so we only can kind of picture this sound. But we also see it's an art of trauma. He revisits it again and again, trying to kind of work his way through it, get it right. So it is not a Monet moment of impressions, your instantaneous perception of impressionism. This is different. This is an art of trauma. Expressionism is going to come after that. It's got a very different focus, not just in what that eye sees in the shifting moment, but what was felt. And that what was felt is the trauma of childhood that is refelt over and over again, that you can't shake. See, a very different kind of feel. This is the stuff I want you to wrap your mind around. Not memorizing buzzwords. You're really getting a feel for what makes expressionism this whole new movement, because it's a very different way. You can see how now we can look at Van Gogh and understand it, not just see it as awkward, if we have a theory of expressionism. All right, big city street scenes. We know our modernists have a love-hate relationship to the big city. To shorten that for you for this period under scrutiny here for this exam, the expressionists see that big city as pretty alienating, pretty dehumanizing. Our Italian futurists, on the other hand, they're going to embrace it because they embrace all things modern. And they get a rush, an adrenaline rush of speed and dynamism from the big city. So you're going to have different conflicting cultural responses to that big city. But this is the first big city scene we really get here with Munch in the 1890s. And it's clearly on the expressionist side of an alienating place where the individual psyche, gets sucked into the herd, into the kind of faceless herd, or you find yourself apart from the herd, alienated, and the anxiety that goes with it. Remember, shrubbery in nature with Munch often takes on a phallic connotation. That's the shift from the world of the fathers to the sons, a world where nature is not necessarily so God-given and divine, but it's becoming human nature, psychological nature, Freudian kinds of motifs popping up. Start to suggest a different kind of subtext at work. Death. This comes from the last final act of motifs from the life of the modern soul. That final aspect, death. And curiously, in this image, the one person he doesn't show is the death, the person who died. So it's not a portrait of the dead person. It's death as something we have to live with. It's death pictured through the faces of those who must go on living with this knowledge of death, with the loss. So you feel this sort of overwhelming presence in this picture of an absence. Death is the presence of an absence, where he leaves this void, so different from pictures of the past, where it's really using a language of painting, using space as a way not to illustrate the scene in detail, but to convey a kind of emptiness, a loss, an overwhelming presence of a loss. So we see each person responding differently, reality filtered through a psyche, individual psyche. This picture brings us to pictures of people who suffer, not pictures who knit. So it's not a genre everyday scene in the way Impressionist scenes often were and scenes in the past. This is really getting again to that issue of trauma and deeper human feelings. We went on to see puberty and Madonna. Puberty would be Act 1, the seeds of love, this kind of moment. Notice how the metaphor here, seeds of love, love's full blossoming. These are mixed metaphors. They speak of having 1 foot in the world of nature, that's your 19th century leg, and 1 foot in the world of the 20th century psyche. So seeds of love, still using a nature motif as something that we're growing, like the life cycle as a flower, we're growing. And this is just it at a very, very young moment. But we have our moment for puberty of the young girl becoming a woman. And all the mysteries of initiation into sexuality that's involved with that. So this is the only painting then, and I can think of a few other artworks that have depicted menstruation. But this is supposed to be her first period, her first menstrual cloud, her first visitation. And he takes that scene, he finds a way to abstract it. He has the little girl look straight out at us, but it looks like pictures from the reverse side of the eyes, and she's looking inward. And this kind of new definition of nature as something that is part of the mysteries of human nature, undergoing the transition from girl to womanhood, or which could be symbolic for all of us, understanding that initiation, that mysterious initiation into sexuality. Well, we're certainly there by this one. So this would be Act 2, Love's Full Blossoming and Passing. And what we get is the femme fatale. Now here, this particular work calls on you to draw on some terminology that have been introduced. Femme fatale, that idea of the fatal woman, the woman who brings men to their doom, a term that starts at this time period, this turn of the century moment. A term that suggests that with all the turmoil and change that the Industrial Revolution has brought, there is a fear, and that fear is the fear of unleashed female sexuality. Where might that go? And that fear means a sort of projection onto the woman. So what we often see, and what by the woman I mean here, a signifier of culture, cultural anxieties. So the woman is often seen as too innocent to be true, that's the goddess, or too evil to be true, and that's the femme fatale, who brings men to their dooms. So the temptress. And we see how he kind of is playing with that kind of concept, or he's reflecting that kind of concept of femme fatale. We also brought in some terminology from Freud. Remember, eros and thanatos. The idea of the life principle being reflected in eros, the desire for love, for sexuality, for recreation, and thanatos, the death wish. So think of it as sex and death coupled. And it tells you, too, about this end of the century time period, this change, the sense of something dying and something new, something modern beginning. But played out in these terms. We have the dancing sperm in the decorative border, terminating in the dead embryo. So you can use this as a way to talk about the time period of rapid change, where identity roles were changing, gender roles were changing as you move from the little village where everybody knows your name to the big city, the big, deep, impersonalized city. And women are kind of crossed into this. This is the moment when hysteria is being kind of diagnosed, and there's a new interest in things like psychotherapy. There was really no movement like that before. This is the beginnings of that type of psychoanalytic study. And it's played out. The beginnings of Freudian psychoanalysis is really played out on hysterical women in the beginning. And what is hysteria? Is it a disease, or is it a cultural dis-ease with the unruly woman who won't fit in? So these are all cultural signifiers of rapid change and these fears of are we losing our way? I mean, I see this election as a kind of moment too, right? Where are we going to restore the world to our American values? Whether you see things going forward as one campaign wants to push it, or whether you see things, you see a need for a return, do you see that as a return to the past? It's probably rosier than people thought. However you want to see it, however you define it, it's this kind of moment of feeling that turmoil and seeing it played out somewhat in gender wars. All right, put it all together, and you get the dance of life, the cycle of life according to Munch. Motifs from the life of modern soul. With Act 1, you start out with the young virginal girl woman just starting to bud, and then she learns to dance. We get the phallic moon, nature already crossed with this idea of Freudian symbolism. The woman in red who loves to dance, that's the second act, love's full blossoming and passing. Angst, the green-red face of lust and envy, and then the woman in black standing for the last stage, the last act, death. So you can see how he's thinking in terms of these bigger, broader allegories, and thinking how he has to modernize and abstract to get us there. Try to find a new language to speak in a symbolist way. So if you identify him as a symbolist and a proto-expressionist, that's good. Really good will be if you can show how the works in question, the works up there, give us some of the important ideas of symbolism or expressionism. Okay. So that's a lot. There's a lot to play with most. You know he's on the exam. Okay, I'll tell you, he is on the exam. All right, you know that. You don't know which month. Maybe that's not so important. You have to figure out. The good people will figure out the good people. The good students will have already figured out almost before they come in some of the key things they want to say about them. And then they'll play and work with the images in front of your face.